We are joined by CBS News national security consultant Fran Townsend. So, Fran, it looks like federal authorities are looking into the background of the man behind the wheel, James Alex Fields Jr. What are they going to be looking for with this guy?
They're looking for any of his contacts, right? They'll be looking at his cell phone contacts, his emails, text messages. They'll be looking for his movements and actions just prior to. Remember, he traveled, I believe it's from Ohio, all the way to Charlottesville to participate. And they will look at his travel along the way. Was he alone? Was he with others? How was this planned in advance or not? All those things, because that will lead them to decide which charges they're able to bring against him.
Right.
Is it common, Fran, to have a federal investigation into a civil rights probe here this early in the investigation? The president announced that yesterday. He's asked the DOJ to open a civil rights investigation into this.
It is, and it's sort of clearly a civil rights violation. The question is, in that toolkit of crimes that you can accuse him of, what are the strongest? What are the most likely to be successful? And because there are federal statutes that directly apply, the feds at the investigative stage will work with local law enforcement, and then they'll have a conversation. Will the feds preempt the state, a potential state case, because they can bring charges that have more serious penalties?
So AG Jeff Sessions called this an act of domestic terrorism. Can you prove that? Or how do you go about building a case for that?
You know what, in some ways, let's step back for a second. The rhetoric is important. The language is important here. So the intentional use of violence by a non-state actor against a civilian population for a political purpose to intimidate is terrorism per se. And so I think it's important. You know, the president didn't use that language yesterday. He's getting some criticism for that. I think this was as much domestic terrorism as the actions against the Minneapolis mosque. And I think it's important. You know, I was one, and so let me be clear here. I criticized President Obama for not calling radical Islamic extremism what it was, because I think it's important that we name evil and we label it.
Words matter.
Words matter here. And I think, you know, we saw the president come back out on Monday because he was getting some criticism for not sort of very clearly denouncing the white supremacists, the neo-Nazis. And he came back out because, as you say, language is really important right now.
So in your mind, did his words go far enough in denouncing these groups?
I think so. I would have liked him to also label it as domestic terrorism, because again, that's what it is.
But did it seem to you, Fran, because the president tweeted a couple of hours after he made that statement that, you know, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, you know, he made the statement, but the press is still not happy, sort of attacking the press. And it almost felt that we're going to put it up there, made additional remarks on Charlottesville, and realized once again that the fake news media will never be satisfied. Truly bad people, almost blaming the media for actions that it's not the media that's called for the president to denounce these groups. It's the people in Charlottesville and across this country.
That's right. Look, but this is a common, as opposed to saying, you know, I regret not having made a stronger initial statement. The president's sort of MO is to come out and attack those who are covering him. In some ways, I think he's made the statement, he's condemned them. It's time to move on now with the investigation and make sure that this man is brought to justice, and anyone who might have been working with him or collaborating with him.
Just in regards to that statement, you know, Vlad, you mentioned this tweet, but also, you know, he opened the statement by talking about the economy. And then later on he tweeted, retweeted something from a blogger that everyone has basically acknowledged, you know, retweets and supports many conspiracy theories that have been debunked. And I'm thinking about sort of the frame before and after that statement and whether he sort of sabotaged himself by doing that.
You know, look, this comes back to the bigger issue about his use of Twitter. In some respects, you have to give him, let's give credit where it's due. He is able to take his message directly, publicly, and around the media, and that's effective. The question is how he frames it. Look, it'd be good if he could have White House staff and talk to them about the language he's going to use, because, as we said, language is important. And these tweets, whether he's intentional or not, they tend to offend people. They, you know, and arguably incite some of the bad conduct we want to put an end to. I mean, just this morning, there's the tweet of a train running over a reporter on the tracks. in light of Charlottesville, a CNN reporter. And so, you know, people say, really?
Yeah.
You know.
Right. Before we get your thoughts on North Korea, Fran, I want to ask you, in 1964, in the wake of the murders of those civil rights workers, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, the FBI made a concerted effort to go after the KKK, other white supremacist groups. But in recent years, we've started to see a spike in that. Is it still a priority for Homeland Security, for the FBI, for other federal law enforcement agencies to look into these organizations and to try and figure out what they're doing and to put a stop to it? Or is it fallen off the radar as we've begun to focus on the war, the global war on terror? We haven't looked as much inward.
You know, I think there's less attention been paid over the last decade or more to domestic terrorism groups, but I can tell you, going back to the Bush administration, there were still investigative units in the FBI and DHS that did focus on this. And you may recall during the Obama administration, when Secretary of DHS Janet Napolitano issued a statement about the threat from these groups, she was criticized. So this has remained, it doesn't get as much resources historically as the international groups, and I think they're going to reevaluate that now because of the rise of the threat.
Off to North Korea now. Kim Jong-un has said that he's going to hold off on plans to launch missiles toward Guam, and he said he's going to watch and see what the Yankees do.
Has he blinked?
You know, I'm wondering, has he blinked? And do you think maybe, you know, there was a lot of argument as to whether or not what we were seeing was a good cop, bad cop scenario with the president using sort of this hardline words, while Rex Tillerson was, you know, over in Asia trying to talk about diplomacy and, you know, encouraging us not to back Kim Jong-un into a corner that he can't get out of. Right. Do you think that's what we saw? Do you think it works?
Look, I don't know that I would say he blanked. I mean, I think we ought to understand that Kim Jong-un seems to engage in some of the same sort of rhetorical devices that President Trump does, right? There's this war of words that goes on, and in the background you've got the military looking at what are the military options. You've got Rex Tillerson looking at what are the diplomatic options. We're talking to China, South Korea, Japan about bringing more pressure on the North Koreans. And so I think it's sort of more like a three-dimensional chess game. It's not quite as sort of the caricature that gets painted in this exchange of threats and insults.
Yeah. Except that when we were in South Korea, most South Koreans feel that this is the status quo. They've been dealing with this for 60 years plus. Whoever's in charge in North Korea, whoever the president is, the rhetoric remains the same.
Yeah. And I think that's right. I mean, what you hope is behind the scenes there are more substantive conversations to try to resolve it. None of the options are good, and you hear that especially from the military, but you can't take that option off the table.
Right.
Fran Townsend, always great to have your insight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fran.